The glow of distant headlights cut through the pitch-black night, flickering like ghosts against the damp Virginia asphalt. The road was empty, stretching endlessly into the dark, a forgotten ribbon of pavement winding through the countryside. The only sound was the soft hum of an engine moving at a steady pace, slicing through the silence like a blade. Rachel Myers sat behind the wheel of her sedan, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. Her hands, steady on the wheel, guided the vehicle with practiced ease. She wasn't in a rush, nor was she distracted. Years of training had ingrained a level of alertness that never truly switched off. She noticed the road signs, the flickering streetlights, the lone gas station they had passed miles ago. Then, in her rearview mirror, the unmistakable flash of red and blue illuminated the darkness. Her heartbeat remained steady, but her mind immediately ran through the possibilities. She had not been speeding. She had not crossed any lines or missed any signals. So why were they stopping her? Rachel signaled and pulled over to the shoulder. The gravel crunched under her tires as the car came to a halt. She exhaled slowly, fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the glove compartment. Her driver's license and registration were inside, neatly organized. She reached for them, but before she could retrieve the documents, a sharp rap against the window made her pause. The beam of a flashlight cut through the glass, sweeping over her face. The officer on the other side of the window stood tall, his shoulders squared with authority. The weight of his presence, the air of unchecked confidence, was something Rachel recognized immediately. She had encountered men like him before. She rolled down the window, her movements deliberate, measured. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. His name tag read Crane. The name meant nothing to her, but the look in his eyes did. Rachel handed over her documents without a word, watching as he examined them. His gaze flicked between the license and her face, as if trying to find something that didn't fit. "You live around here?" he asked, almost casually. Rachel tilted her head slightly, reading between the lines. The question wasn't about residency. It was about belonging. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm. A second officer, stockier with a buzz cut, lingered near the trunk of her car. His stance was more relaxed, but there was something rehearsed about it, as though he was waiting for a cue. His name tag read Miller. Crane passed her license back, but didn't move away. "You mind popping the trunk for us?" Rachel's fingers tensed ever so slightly before she pressed the release latch. She could already see where this was going. Miller's flashlight illuminated the interior of the trunk, casting long shadows against the fabric lining. A moment of silence. Then, "Well, would you look at that?" Miller called out, his voice carrying an exaggerated sense of discovery. Rachel didn't need to turn to know what he was holding. But she did anyway. A small clear plastic bag dangled from his gloved fingers. Inside, a fine white powder. Rachel's breath remained even, though inside, her mind was calculating at lightning speed. She had checked her car before leaving. There had been nothing there. Crane let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "That's a real shame." Rachel turned her gaze back to him, her expression unreadable. She could already see the future playing out in their heads. The arrest, the paperwork, the closed case. But they had miscalculated. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped out of the car, closing the door behind her. She met Crane's gaze, unflinching, her posture relaxed but commanding. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice low, controlled. Crane's smirk wavered for a fraction of a second before returning in full force. "That's so." Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because by the time the night was over, they would know exactly who they had framed. The holding cell smelled of rust and stale sweat, a confined space meant to break people before they even stepped into a courtroom. The steel bars were cold beneath Rachel's fingertips, their metallic by a sharp contrast to the warmth of her skin. She had been here before, not in this exact cell, but in places like it, where the walls whispered of injustice, where the weight of power tilted too heavily to one side. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her back straight, her breathing even. There was no sign of panic in her expression, no restless shifting of her limbs. She was waiting, calculating. Across the room, just beyond the bars, Officers Crane and Miller leaned against the station's front desk, their laughter cutting through the quiet like jagged glass. Crane held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, gesturing lazily with the other as he recounted something to a fellow officer. Miller, more subdued, nodded along, his posture less certain than before. Rachel watched them, her gaze steady, dissecting their body language. Crane was the dominant one, the one who led the game. Miller was a follower, someone who played along, because it was easier than resisting. She had seen this dynamic before, in criminals, in politicians, in soldiers who had lost their sense of morality. The station was quiet at this hour. A few officers moved between desks, the fluorescent lighting above casting harsh white pools onto the scuffed linoleum floor. Most ignored her. That was their first mistake. A young officer, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable, approached her cell. His name tag read Keller. Unlike the others, he didn't exude the same overconfidence. He hesitated before speaking. "Your attorney is on his way." His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. Rachel tilted her head slightly. He had the posture of a man wrestling with his conscience. Good. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, watching the way he shifted his weight, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. He was nervous. "Something doesn't sit right with you," she finally said, her voice even. It wasn't a question. Keller swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the desk where Crane and Miller still stood, then back to Rachel. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. I've seen a lot of arrests. This one feels off." Rachel leaned forward slightly, just enough to force him to hold her gaze. "You ever wonder why it's always the same kind of people in these cells?" she asked, her tone calm, measured. Keller inhaled sharply, as if she had struck a nerve. Before he could answer, the heavy door to the station's main entrance swung open. A man in a charcoal gray suit strode in, his presence immediate and commanding. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket as he approached the desk, his movements precise, calculated. Ben Carter. Rachel's attorney. Crane turned, his smirk widening. "You're late," he said, voice thick with amusement. Carter didn't blink. "And you're out of line." He handed over a file, his expression unreadable. "Let's talk about why you've detained my client without cause." The room shifted. The ease in Crane's posture stiffened ever so slightly. Rachel caught it, the flicker of irritation, the momentary calculation behind his eyes. He hadn't expected resistance. He thought this would be easy. Keller took a step back, his hands clasped behind his back. Rachel tracked his movements. He wasn't like the others. He still had a choice to make. Crane sighed dramatically. "Your client was in possession of narcotics." Carter arched a brow. "And let me guess, your body cam was off when you found them." Silence. Rachel exhaled slowly, allowing a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips. The first crack in their foundation. Crane chuckled, but there was a forced edge to it. "You lawyers always think you can talk your way out of anything." Carter didn't flinch. "And men like you always think no one's paying attention." The tension in the room thickened, a slow-building pressure that promised an inevitable collapse. Rachel didn't have to say anything. She simply leaned back against the cold metal bench, her gaze settling on Crane and Miller like a predator assessing its prey. They thought they had caged her, but they had no idea who was really trapped. The air inside the police station felt heavier than before, as if the weight of the truth was pressing against the walls, daring them to crumble. Rachel remained seated in her cell, her posture as composed as ever, but the energy in the room had shifted. The moment her attorney, Ben Carter, walked in, the game changed. Across the room, Officer Crane's confident smirk had dimmed slightly, though he did his best to hide it. Miller, his partner, wasn't as skilled at masking unease. His shoulders tensed, his fingers twitching near the belt of his uniform. They were beginning to feel the cracks beneath their feet. Ben adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket before turning his sharp gaze toward Crane. "Let's go over this again," he said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "My client was pulled over for what exactly?" Crane let out an exaggerated sigh, as if he were dealing with an inconvenience rather than a man with the power to dismantle his entire operation. "Failure to come to a complete stop," he said. "Routine traffic violation." Ben's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, not quite a frown. "Routine traffic violation," he echoed, his tone laced with skepticism. "And yet you saw fit to search her trunk. No warrant, no probable cause, no record of suspicious behavior." Crane's jaw tensed. She consented to the search. Rachel remained silent, watching as Ben turned slightly toward her. His gaze flicked over her face, and she knew he had already read her response without her having to say a word. She consented, he repeated, turning back to Crane. Interesting. Because my client tells me she didn't. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against his thigh in a rhythmic motion. He was nervous. Crane, on the other hand, doubled down. It's her word against ours. Ben took a deep breath, exhaling slowly before stepping forward. His movements were deliberate, controlled. See, that's where things get complicated, he said. Because unlike you, my client actually knows the law. And I find it very hard to believe that someone as well-versed in legal procedures as Rachel Myers would voluntarily allow you to violate her Fourth Amendment rights. Rachel didn't move, didn't react, but she felt the ripple of unease spread through the station. Ben had just set the first real stone in place. Crane, however, wasn't ready to back down. The drugs were found in her car, he snapped. She's guilty. It's that simple. Ben tilted his head slightly, as if studying a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. That's simple, huh? He turned to the desk sergeant behind the counter. Sergeant, may I see the chain of custody report? The sergeant hesitated before retrieving the file. Ben took his time flipping through it, his expression giving nothing away. Then, with precise movements, he turned the file toward the officers and tapped his finger on a particular line. No signatures confirming the moment of discovery, he said, his voice even. No timestamps from the officers who allegedly found the drugs. He raised his gaze, almost like they weren't there at all. Miller's breathing grew heavier. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides. Crane, however, wasn't done playing. You lawyers always think you can spin a story, he sneered. This isn't a movie. We have all the evidence we need. Ben exhaled sharply through his nose, as if disappointed. You think so, he murmured. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a USB drive. Rachel knew what was on it before he even spoke. She had seen this coming. She had planned for it. This is a copy of the station security footage from earlier tonight, Ben said, holding the small device between his fingers. Which, by the way, I managed to obtain before anyone had a chance to, let's say, conveniently misplace it. Miller paled. Crane's smirk faltered. Ben handed the drive to the sergeant. Why don't we all take a look? For the first time, real silence filled the room. The kind of silence that comes before the fall. Rachel let the moment stretch, let the weight of it settle over the station like a slow-building storm. Crane and Miller had played this game for years, but they had never played it against someone like her. They were about to learn just how dangerous she really was. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the station's scuffed linoleum floor, creating long angular shadows beneath the rows of desks. The atmosphere inside the room had shifted. What had started as an ordinary night for officers Crane and Miller was now spiraling into something neither of them had anticipated. The USB drive sat untouched on the sergeant's desk, its presence an unspoken threat. Ben Carter remained still, his expression unreadable, his patience measured. He wasn't in a rush. He knew what was about to happen. Rachel remained seated in her holding cell, silent, composed. She wasn't just watching this unfold. She was orchestrating it. The sergeant finally reached for the USB, inserting it into the station's computer. The monitor flickered, and then video footage appeared. The grainy black and white surveillance footage showed the moment Rachel had been pulled over. It showed Crane speaking to her at the driver's side window, while Miller circled to the back. The audio was faint, but the image was clear enough. Rachel had remained composed, her hands visible at all times. Crane had spoken, taken her license, glanced toward Miller. Then came the moment of the so-called discovery. Miller had opened the trunk, leaned inside, and after a few seconds pulled back, holding a small plastic bag. The problem? The bag had appeared from his own jacket pocket. A ripple of tension spread through the station. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Crane's breath hitched, his jaw tightening as the realization set in. They had been caught. Miller took a step back, his face paling. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Ben folded his arms across his chest. Care to explain that? The room remained frozen, the officers stationed at their desks glancing toward one another, murmuring under their breaths. A few exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it was the first time someone had undeniable proof. The sergeant cleared his throat. Pause the video. The footage stopped. The image of Miller's hand holding the bag of planted evidence now frozen on the screen like a smoking gun. Rachel let the silence stretch, waiting. She had spent years perfecting patience. In interrogation rooms, in operations where timing meant the difference between life and death, in situations where one wrong word could tip the scales against her. Crane, however, was running out of patience. His pulse was visible against his temple, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "This proves nothing," he snapped. "That could have been recorded at any time." Ben exhaled sharply, almost amused. "You really want to double down on this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Because last I checked, tampering with evidence is a felony. And obstruction of justice." He clicked his tongue. "That one comes with a real nice prison sentence." Miller was no longer looking at Crane. His breathing had become uneven, his forehead damp with sweat. The weight of the moment was settling over him, suffocating him. Rachel could tell he was close to breaking. She watched as Miller turned his gaze toward her, his eyes flickering with something. Regret? Fear? A silent plea? She didn't blink. She had no intention of saving him. The sergeant exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "This is serious," he muttered. He turned to Crane and Miller. "Both of you in my office." No. Crane didn't move. His jaw clenched, his muscles visibly coiling under the pressure. "I want my union rep," he said flatly. Miller, however, was already backing away. His voice cracked, and he swallowed thickly. "I didn't." "You didn't what?" Ben interrupted, his voice deceptively soft. "You didn't plant evidence? Because that footage tells a different story." Miller looked around the room, as if searching for an escape. The walls were closing in. Rachel stood slowly, stepping toward the bars of her cell. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, calculated. "You thought you had the power," she murmured, just loud enough for Miller to hear. "But it was never yours to begin with." His eyes snapped to hers, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed again. Crane turned sharply, his expression unreadable. "Don't say another word," he hissed at Miller. But it was already too late. Rachel watched as the younger officer took a slow, shaky breath. His gaze darted to the frozen image on the screen, his own hand, his own mistake, captured forever. Then he looked back at the sergeant. "I need to talk," he whispered. Crane's expression darkened. Ben's smirk returned. Rachel tilted her head ever so slightly, watching it all unfold, feeling the pieces of the game fall into place. The walls were crumbling. The truth was breaking through. And the men who had built this system of lies, they were about to watch it all burn. The courtroom was packed. The air inside was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones, the kind that signaled something monumental was about to happen. Lawyers shuffled papers, journalists murmured in hushed voices, and spectators leaned forward, waiting. Everyone knew this was more than just another case. This was about power, about corruption, about what happened when the system got too comfortable in its own deception. At the center of it all sat Rachel Myers. She was composed, her hands folded neatly on the table before her, her gaze steady. She didn't fidget. She didn't shift uncomfortably. She waited, because she had already won. Across the room, Officers Crane and Miller sat at the defendant's table. Miller looked pale, his knee bouncing under the table in a steady, nervous rhythm. Crane, in contrast, was rigid, his jaw locked, his hands clenched into fists. He was still trying to play the game, still trying to believe he could bluff his way out of this. Rachel had seen men like him before. They never knew when to fold. The judge entered. A sharp rap of the gavel silenced the murmurs in the room. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The prosecution wasted no time. Ben Carter stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, even. "We are here today because of a lie. A lie that two police officers thought they could get away with. A lie that almost destroyed an innocent woman's life." He let that sit for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Then he turned toward Rachel, gesturing to her. "Ms. Myers is not just any woman. She is a law-abiding citizen, a professional, someone who was minding her own business when Officers Crane and Miller pulled her over under false pretenses. They searched her vehicle without cause. They planted evidence, and they thought no one would ever question them. Crane's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is conjecture. Ben turned, completely unfazed. Your Honor, I will be presenting irrefutable evidence to support this claim. This is not conjecture. This is fact. The judge glanced at the defense attorney, then nodded. Objection overruled. Proceed. Ben didn't miss a beat. He turned to the screen at the front of the courtroom. Let's take a look at the footage, shall we? The room was silent as the video played. The jury watched as Crane and Miller pulled Rachel over. They watched as Miller reached into his own jacket and produced the plastic bag before pretending to discover it in the trunk. They saw Rachel remain calm, measured, controlled, not the panic of someone caught, but the silence of someone who already knew what was happening. Then came the final, damning blow. The unedited audio. Miller's voice caught on the station security camera, whispering, "She's just another one. No one will believe her." The impact was instantaneous. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the front row gasped audibly. The journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. One of the jurors, an older man with graying hair, shook his head in disgust. Rachel remained still. She had already known this moment was coming. Miller, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently in his ear, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the screen, watching his own betrayal play out in real time. Then Crane made his final mistake. He scoffed. Loudly. Ben's head tilted, his expression one of genuine curiosity. Something funny, Officer Crane? Crane straightened his tie, forcing a smirk. You think one mistake proves anything? You think a jury is going to convict two decorated officers because of one bad call? Ben didn't react. Instead, he stepped back, turning to Miller. Officer Miller, he said, would you like to take the stand? Silence. Miller froze. Crane's smirk slipped for the first time. Don't say a word, he hissed. Rachel's gaze flicked toward Miller. She could see it, the war inside him. The realization that Crane would let him take the fall. The sinking weight of knowing there was no way out except through the truth. Miller swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed. Then slowly he stood. Crane's breath hitched. You idiot, he whispered. Miller didn't look at him. He walked to the witness stand, his steps heavy with the gravity of what he was about to do. Rachel leaned back slightly, watching. The system was finally starting to eat itself from the inside. And she was simply waiting for the final collapse. The courtroom was silent, but the tension inside it was deafening. The kind of silence that came before a storm, the moment before thunder cracked the sky open. Miller sat in the witness stand, his hands gripping the wooden edges so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing was shallow, his pulse visibly thrumming against his neck. He looked small, suddenly aware of just how fragile his position had become. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the hunted. Across the room, Crane sat frozen, his fingers twitching against the table, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he was holding back a snarl. He had never thought it would come to this. But Rachel had. She had known from the moment she stepped into this courthouse that the system would eventually turn on itself. Corruption, when exposed to light, had a tendency to self-destruct. Ben Carter, Rachel's attorney, approached the witness stand with the slow, methodical steps of a man who already knew the outcome of the game. Officer Miller, Ben said, his voice measured, calculated. Do you understand that you are under oath? Miller swallowed hard. Yes. Ben folded his hands behind his back. And do you understand the penalties for perjury? Miller nodded, sweat beading along his hairline. I do. Ben's gaze sharpened. Then tell me, Officer Miller, was the evidence found in Rachel Meyer's car planted by you and Officer Crane? The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Rachel remained motionless at the defense table, watching, waiting. Miller exhaled sharply. His eyes darted toward Crane, as if seeking some kind of lifeline. But Crane was rigid, his expression unreadable, his eyes burning with unspoken warning. And that was when Miller knew. Crane wouldn't go down for this. He wouldn't take responsibility. If Miller didn't speak now, he would be left to drown alone. Slowly, his lips parted. His voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. The explosion that followed wasn't one of sound, but of reaction. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jurors shifted in their seats, the weight of what they had just heard settling over them like a lead blanket. A reporter in the front row furiously scribbled on a notepad, her eyes wide with disbelief. Even the judge, a man who had likely seen countless betrayals in his years on the bench, lifted a brow. Ben remained calm, his voice steady. "Just to be clear," he said, "you are admitting, under oath, that the drugs found in Ms. Myers' vehicle were not hers? That they were placed there by you and Officer Crane?" Miller's voice cracked. "Yes." Rachel inhaled slowly. "Checkmate." Crane shot to his feet. "You lying son of a—" "Sit down, Officer Crane," the judge barked, slamming his gavel against the desk. "Or I'll hold you in contempt." Crane's nostrils flared, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His entire world was falling apart before his eyes. Miller swallowed again, his breathing uneven. "He told me to do it," he rushed out, words tumbling from his mouth. Crane said no one would care. He said it was just another case, that no one would believe her anyway. Rachel didn't flinch, though her fingers curled ever so slightly against the table. Just another case. That was what they had thought. They had underestimated the wrong woman. The prosecution attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor, in light of this testimony, we are formally requesting immediate action against Officers Crane and Miller." The judge's gaze darkened. "Noted," he said. Officer Crane remained seated. "You will have your chance to speak." But Crane didn't want to speak. He wanted to escape. His gaze darted around the room, searching for some way out. But there was none. His past had finally caught up to him. Rachel exhaled a slow, steady breath. She knew what would come next. The system didn't change overnight. But today it cracked open just enough to let the truth in. The weight of the confession still hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. The courtroom remained eerily silent, as if even the walls themselves were absorbing the gravity of what had just happened. Rachel Myers sat motionless, her gaze steady as she observed the aftermath of Miller's betrayal. It was always the weakest link that gave out first. Judge Harper leaned forward, his expression unreadable as he addressed the prosecution. "In light of Officer Miller's testimony, I will be issuing an immediate suspension of both officers pending further investigation. The court will also be moving forward with criminal charges against Officer Crane for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power." A murmur spread through the crowd. The reporters in the front row were already typing away on their laptops, their headlines forming before the ink had even dried. Officer John Crane, the man who had once carried himself with unshakable arrogance, now looked hollow. His face was pale, his hands shaking against the polished wooden surface of the defendant's table. For the first time, he had no control. The officers standing guard moved toward him, their expressions blank but their purpose clear. Crane jolted to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a joke," he spat. His voice no longer carried the authority it once did. Now, it was raw, desperate. Miller, still seated, buried his face in his hands. He had already accepted his fate. Crane's attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, attempting to calm him, but the damage had been done. He had lost. Rachel let the moment settle, let the weight of it fill the room. This was what justice looked like. Not just a verdict, not just a sentence, but the moment a corrupt man realized that the power he had wielded for so long had finally been stripped from him. The judge turned to Rachel's attorney. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything else to present?" Ben Carter stood, buttoning his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. "No, Your Honor. I believe we've made our case." Harper nodded. He turned his attention to Rachel. "Ms. Myers, on behalf of this court, I offer my apologies for what has transpired. You are hereby cleared of all charges, effective immediately." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, sealing the fate of the case. A beat passed, then another, and then the room erupted. Journalists swarmed toward Rachel's attorney, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Spectators murmured to one another, shaking their heads in disbelief at how close the system had come to swallowing yet another innocent person. Rachel exhaled, slow and steady. She had won, but she wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end. As she stood, her eyes met those of a familiar figure in the back of the courtroom. Davis Hamilton, a high-ranking official within the CIA. He had been there the entire time. Rachel made her way toward the exit. Her posture relaxed, but her senses heightened. She knew why he was here. "You made quite the spectacle," he said, falling into step beside her. Rachel allowed a small smirk to cross her lips. "It was necessary." Hamilton hummed in response. "It also put a lot of eyes on you." She shrugged. "Let them look." They reached the courthouse steps, where the sunlight spilled over the pavement, warming the chill of the events that had unfolded inside. Hamilton sighed, shaking his head. "This isn't the last time something like this will happen, you know." Rachel glanced toward the street, where reporters were still talking into cameras, recounting the trial's most shocking moments. "I know," she said quietly. "Good." Hamilton handed her a folded piece of paper. "When you're ready for something bigger." She took it without looking, slipping it into the pocket of her coat. Without another word, she stepped into crowd, disappearing into the sea of people, the whispers of justice trailing in her wake. For now, this battle was won. But Rachel Myers wasn't finished. She never would be.